hope you all enjoyed this, and we are going to get into it as soon as I find the pointer. Okay.
Go down.
Probably gonna need
Go
pointers
down
soon.
one.
Huh?
Go down one button.
Thank you. All right, so this is the connection between World War II comic propaganda and comic books. So, pop quiz. Comic books have been a colorful form of entertainment in the U.S. since 1938. Before that was usually like Penny Dreadfuls, that type of thing. Since the beginning, comic stories have heavily focused on action, battle between good guys and bad guys. You know, the same thing that we hear in most literature, the battle between good and evil. That narrative directly intersects with the agenda of propaganda, which is to show one of the sides as a force of good, fighting to defeat the common enemy who threatens all we hold dear, to be a little melodramatic about it. And even Americans who've never, intentionally read a comic book, or who are maybe, not familiar, are probably familiar with some comic book icons, believe it or not, who were used as a source of propaganda. So here's my pop quiz, concept taken directly from Ben's presentation last month. There is a character who was drafted into service in 1941, prior to the U.S. entering World War II, and retired after 43 years of service. Anybody want to guess what character that is?
Beetlebaby.
Nope.
Oh, no, that was mine. Captain America.
Nope. Nope. Nobody? I know Ruby knows because she saw the slide.
G.I. Joe.
Nope. Ruby, what is it?
Donald.
Donald Duck.
Oh.
Yep. Donald Duck. And since Ruby was paying attention earlier, she gets the prize.
Yeah, but she cheated.
Well, there's cheating and then there's educated. She hasn't educated yet. She saw the slide. Yeah. So in 1984, they actually retired Donald. And you might question, wait a minute, Donald Duck is wearing a sailor suit. Why is he a member of the Army? I don't know. So, according to the Department of Defense, Donald Duck was officially drafted into the U.S. Army in 1941, prior to the U.S. actually entering the war. And yes, despite the fact that he does wear a sailor suit, he was enlisted in the Army, not the Navy. But he was given the rare honor of actually being declared an honorary member of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps. So he belongs to 3 different service branches. And he was also featured on over 216 military unit designs, the patches that they wear during the war. He appeared on patches, he appeared on planes. He was on a lot of things. He was very popular, which surprisingly he is not popular now. It took me a long time to find a stuffed animal of Donald Duck. On May 19th, 1984, 50-year-old Donald Duck officially served his discharge papers from the Department of Defense during the Armed Forces Day in Torrance, California. Donald appeared in his World War II uniform, accompanied by Daisy Duck. He was promoted to Sergeant E5 for his retirement ceremony by then Lieutenant General Arthur E. Brown Jr. Do you know, in order to look at Donald Duck's military history papers, you have to fill out a Freedom of Information Act. You can't make this stuff up. Okay, so in this presentation, I'm going to discuss what is comic book propaganda, who the target audience was of this propaganda, and what was it trying to accomplish, and why was it so successful, and what are the lasting impacts? So what is propaganda? The simple definition is of propaganda and who creates it. For Merriam-Webster, propaganda is the spreading of ideas, information, or rumor for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, a cause, or a person. The government office we do have an official office of propaganda. Prior to the war, it was called the Office of Facts and Figures. Never heard of them. During the war, World War II, when I say the war, that's the war I'm going to be referring to. It was changed to the United States Office of War Information, or OWI. And this was a United States government agency created during World War II. The OWI operated from June 1942 until September of 1945. This office was responsible for propaganda both domestically and internationally. However, the OWI rarely used the comic book medium to directly spread propaganda. Created in 1942 was something called the Writers' War Board, and the WWB was technically a private organization. It was funded through the federal OWI and essentially acted as a government operation, though. And this was created from comic book publishers. They created stories and based on input from the Writers' Board, Comics Committee and many comic book publishers, writers, and artists really wanted to use their platform, even prior to America entering the war, to get us involved in the war, because it was not a popular opinion at that time that we needed to be involved in World War II. And one of the reasons why they pushed it so heavily is because a lot of these writers and artists and publishers were of Jewish descent, and they still had families over in Europe, and they saw what was going on over there, and they heard the horror stories, and they thought, we really need to step up and get involved. And these are the logos of the Writers' War Board, which is kind of plain. They didn't obviously include their artists, and then the OWI. Okay. Action Comics number 37, and June 1941, number 43 in 1941. So these both show Superman. And prior to World War II, a great number of the writers really pushed. As you can see, these were both prior to World War I, our involvement, U.S. involvement in World War I. But yet here's Superman fighting Nazis already. Yeah, two of the most famous writers that were, really pushing these were the creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. These were a couple of high school students. Well, they were high school students when they created Superman. Can you imagine that, peaking in high school by creating Superman? What do you do after that? They were from high school buddies from Cleveland, Ohio, and when they created this pop culture icon, specifically, they really meant to drum up support for America's entry into the war. Before their attack on Pearl Harbor, American opinion really didn't support the need to take a stand in this at all. So, Captain America issue number 1. First issue of Captain America. He's punching Hitler. This is one of the most famous comic book covers ever. And again, 6 months prior to, or 9 months prior to the U.S. entry into World War II. Have I been saying World War I?
Sometimes.
Sorry. Thank you. That's the war I'm talking about, the second one. In March 1941, 9 months prior to Pearl Harbor, Captain America was on the cover of Captain America number 1, punching Hitler. This was an obvious attempt to sway the American opinion. This was Captain America's debut issue. This is the first thing he's ever seen doing, and it sold 1 million copies. He was immediately a popular comic figure. And Jack Kirby, who is the artist who's best known for creating Captain America with Joe Simon, took an artistic hiatus. This is how much he believed in it, to go fight during the war. You create Captain America, the next thing you do is go sign up for service. These people really believed in what they were doing, the messages that they were pushing out there. Other notable entries, these are all characters who served or were seen fighting Nazis or the Japanese prior to World War II. Our entry: Batman, the Human Torch, Submariner, Green Lantern, Liberty Bell, Uncle Sam, and Wonder Woman. At least some of you have heard of some of those people. As we entered the war, comic books focused their propaganda messages in a number of different ways, including how those left at home could help the war effort, but also in some ways that might make the majority of us a little uncomfortable today, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So let's talk about who the audiences were and why they were so popular. At the beginning of the comic book industry in the early 20th century, comic books were considered to be the very lowest level of art. At the top tier, you had the daily comic strips in the newspaper, surprisingly. That kind of surprised me. Not the fine artists, no. The top tier were daily comic strips in the newspapers. That's where all the artists and writers wanted to be. And at the time, newspapers had a massive readership that catered specifically to adults. Kids would read the comics, but the newspapers really were sold for adults. At the other end of the spectrum, well below the illustrated advertisement work, like you would see advertising illustrations, was the humble comic book. Comic books were seen as lowbrow and aimed toward children. Often writers in comics used pseudonyms to hide their identities when taking comic book work, afraid they'd no longer be taken seriously in their careers. That's how we got Stan Lee from Stanley Lieber and Jack Kirby from Jacob Kutzberg. This began to change with the advent of the first superhero comics. More adults started taking notice. In 1935, there were only 19 comic books produced on a monthly basis. 4 years later, in 1939, there are 322 comic books produced every month. That amounted to about 15 million comic book issues flying off the newsstands every month. Comic books had an advantage over other forms of media that were used as propaganda because they were self-contained. They were portable, they were shareable, and at 10 cents an issue, mostly affordable for most of the population. By the summer of 1942, comic book readership had matured, both in the average age of the reader as well as the circulation numbers. It was estimated that each comic book was shared on the average of 5 times. 180 million people read comic books per year, with about 40% of the country reading comic books every month. I can't imagine any form of media other than the internet right now that 40% of our country reads every month. So a little bit of insight into comic book readership. I know these numbers are very small up here. The first column shows the percentage under 11. So we had 90% of those age 11 or younger were regular comic book readers, as you'd expect. Oh, let's try this back. 80% of those 12 to 17 were comic book readers. 34% of adults 18 to 35 read at least 6 comic books a month. 15% of adults over 30 were regular comic book readers, and another 10% being occasional readers. One study showed in 1944 that students reported that they read an average of 5 comic books a day. Who knew? That's a lot of popular. There were no cat videos, is why. That's got to be the reason. Back in the time before we were all connected through the internet, it was an astonishing reach for readership for a piece of entertainment media. Okay. So what were some of the specific aims of propaganda found in comic books? Well, number one was the increase in morale among service personnel. Superheroes were glorified the GIs on the cover of summer issues, like here 1942's World's Finest Comic number 6. The patriotic red, white, and blue cover loosely approximates an American flag. We see Robin shaking hands with an army soldier, with a smiling Batman looking on in approval. Superman has his arm around the shoulder of a Navy serviceman. And DC public policy declared America's fighting men were the real supermen of the world. The message was pretty clear. Servicemen were the heroes on par with the much admired men in capes. So there were some other aims generally for for the home front. Promote war stamps and war bonds. Now we all know what war bonds are. War stamps were what was aimed toward children. If they bought so many war stamps with their allowance, then they could turn it in and have a war bond. So it wasn't such a big purchase on their part. And here you see, Batman and Robin and Superman selling war stamps. And one of the things that we're not so politically correct anymore, it says, sink the Japanazis with bonds and stamps. We wouldn't probably see that anymore. Promote victory gardens. I know some of you probably are at least a little familiar with what a victory garden is. Here you have Batman, Superman, and Robin again. They got a lot of stuff. Promote paper drives and recycle metals. And this is a paper, showing a paper drive, and there's some other verbiage there. I can't quite read it on the screen, but it was really clear. This is going to make a difference. We need to gather up all of our paper, which is why, strangely enough, we don't see a lot of rare older comic books, is because they got turned in, and now they're worth millions if you did not turn yours in. Okay, also, providing America positive information, and this is something that we aimed at the international scene. These comic books were given out not only to our servicemen, but they were also given out to foreign populations in countries where we were. So if we were, for say, you had a battalion in France, they would leave these behind so that you would know that the most important man on earth was FDR. These were all very much, and they had each of the allied countries had their own version of this. I saw another one with Churchill, also one of the most important men. I guess they couldn't quite agree on who was the most important. Or maybe they just couldn't, they wanted to tie, I don't know. So these comic books were developed with the intention of educating and informing the U.S. citizens and U.S. military, while also being entertaining and engaging. Many of these comics' goals were to educate soldiers on specific duties. They showcased the life of the American soldier while deployed to audiences back home, and explained U.S. foreign policy and for specific actions and conflicts. It also put a really America positive spin on anything that we showed to other countries. It was like, look how great America is. We're here to save you. We were not very modest about our goals. It also portrayed enemy countries and citizens as actual monsters. Definitely not politically correct anymore. Superman says you can slap a jack with war bonds and stamps. We definitely, not something we would be seeing nowadays. The top slide shows Japanese soldiers with tentacles, meaning they were literal monsters, and they portrayed the Germans as all very, bloodthirsty and very, hate-mongering. It was a different time. We wouldn't be seeing this kind of information out there anymore, but it definitely got the message across and stirred up the emotions it was supposed to stir up within the audience. So, according to historian Paul Hirsch, when it came to U.S. enemies abroad, the WWB consciously stoked Americans' hatred. Before 1944, comic book writers and illustrators used Nazis as villains, but sometimes depicted ordinary Germans as decent people. Starting in late 1944, the WWB called for them to change their approach. Fearing that comics treated America's enemies too lightly, the board encouraged very specific hatreds based on race and ethnicity to build support for the increasingly brutal U.S. policy of total war. Believe it or not, the U.S. government actually produced comic books, and this is one of them. This is Torchy #1. Yeah. I learned about this from a very strange place, Antiques Roadshow. Educational program at its finest. In World War II, the largest single purchaser of U.S. comic books was the U.S. military. So it's not surprisingly, they got in on the creation and publication of these books as the war progressed. This is Torchy. She was created by Bill Ward after he was drafted into World War II. Originally, she appeared in the Fort Hamilton, which is a Brooklyn-based newspaper, before being syndicated to other Army newspapers and then finally becoming a comic book. And she served as a morale booster during the war. Torchy is an example of good girl art. Now, these illustrations were not representative of girls' good moral values. They served as a way to allow soldiers to girl watch, providing depictions of beautiful women, usually in skimpy clothing, a lot of times in risky situations, being rescued by men, of course. Another way that they produced, another reason for government-produced comic books was used to combat the 25% illiteracy rate among draftees. At the beginning of the war, 25% of the men drafted were functionally illiterate. This is not somebody you want handing a gun to, saying, here, learn how to use this and go shoot people. If you can't read, that might not be the best way to do it. So these books got soldiers used to learning military procedures with visual instructions. I found this comic book style instruction manual on how to care for an M16. So this is a little bit later. I did not find any of the surviving World War II manuals, but historians have also noted that the existence of these manuals did begin in World War II. It's much cheaper to produce a comic book than it is an educational movie, and it's just as effective. So I'm also to be telling you that, who's also asked to remind you that this is still how they do this. One of my friends that served in the military in the 90s said he still learns how to do manuals. These kind of manuals are still used to teach things about like hygiene and gear care, all sorts of things. So that's still being used. Although I don't think we have nearly the illiteracy rate. It's just a good instruction technique. So in conclusion, why was comic book propaganda so successful? Well, because it was so accessible and so easily read, and it was eye candy. They liked looking at it. It was easy to digest. You could pass it out to a broad swath of people at one time. And then what are some of the lasting impacts of this comic book propaganda? Well, you had the rise of superheroes and patriotic heroes especially. And then for the first time in literature of this type, we saw strong women protagonists like Wonder Woman. Before it would be some soldier or some hero rescuing the woman. Well, Wonder Woman didn't need anybody to rescue her. And now it did show a rise of the patriotic and superheroes until after World War II came to a close. And when the soldiers came back, they no longer wanted to see this type of comic book. They went more for the horror version or the Western or the romantic comics before shifting back again to superheroes, which I think we can clearly see that's where we are now. It also, in general, just elevated the comic book industry. After the war ended, comics became really a mainstream form of artwork and a legitimate storytelling. And you can see that now. I mean, it's such a big business. I mean, you can probably name 10, 20 superhero movies that come out in the last decade or so. It is a huge business. Just Pensacola alone is a huge boost to the Pensacola economy. And to follow up, I'll just give you a little bit of recommending reading if you want any more information about this. This is a couple of books: War, Politics, and Superheroes, Ethics and Propaganda in Comics and Films by Mark Diapollo, and The 10-Cent War, Comic Books, Propaganda in World War II by Tricia Goodnow and James Kimball. And does anybody have any questions?
I couldn't help but not notice that on the one with the heroes where FDR was, in the bottom corner it showed Molly Pitcher.